The most important thing you need to know about the story you're trying to tell is what is your genre. You have to know your genre. This is the most important thing. If you don't have this right, if you don't have this locked in and figured out, your story is going to ramble on and not actually be about anything. But before we can even talk about genre, we have to talk about the unfortunate misunderstanding a lot of people have around this topic and the way they talk about it. What I found is when writers are talking about genre, they're often not actually talking about genre, they're talking about something else. So for instance, I see a lot of writers say that they write young adult. Well, what does that mean? What does that actually tell me about the story? It doesn't actually tell me anything about a story. It actually would be more like if you saw a movie and I said, what was the movie about? And you said, well, it was PG-13. It's like, well, okay, that's good to know, but that's not really my question. I'm asking what your story is about, which is what genre is trying to get to. But when you tell me you write young adult, all you're really saying is, oh, there's not going to be a lot of sex, a lot of cussing, and a lot of violence, which is good to know, but it's not genre. Another thing people might say is science fiction or fantasy, which again, isn't what the story is about. Now, I do know something about it. I know the setting of the story. I know maybe a little bit about how the world might look, but I still don't know what the story is about. I don't know the value at stake in the story. I don't know what the characters want in the story. So when we're talking about genre, we need to talk about something that is actually concrete, something we can wrap our hands around, and something that our story is actually about. And so to get to genre, we actually have to go through this thing called the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I actually have a poster. My wife made this one. Let me get it. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is super important for us to know. We're going to go over this right now. The thing you have to understand about genre is it's about a value. It's about something our characters want and need. And so when we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you see it goes from physiological, like eating and staying alive, all the way up to self-actualization. And then if you start mapping genres onto that, you find something that our story is actually about. So at StoryGrid, we map 12 genres. We have action, war, horror, crime, and thriller. We have Western Eastern, which is just one genre. Love. We have performance and society. So those are the first 9. Those are external genres. Now, when we're getting to the top end of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what you're going to see is that it starts turning, instead of an external need that people are trying to find, they're actually trying to solve an internal need. And that's where we look at the 3 genres: status, morality, and worldview. So when we're talking about genre, we're actually asking the question, what is our story about? What value on those Maslow's hierarchy of needs is our story about? When I've read manuscripts, when I've read drafts of manuscripts, and they don't really know their genre, it just kind of wanders around. So there might be a little bit of a love story, there might be some action in there might be a thriller in there might be some freedom in there might be some worldview in there. And there's really no one thing that the story is all about. And so in StoryGrid, we tell you, you have to pick one genre that your story is going to focus on. Now, of course, there's going to be other things in your story. There might be a love story plot. There might be a crime plot. But if your story is action, that means all of the major moments in your story have to turn on life and death, because that's what action is all about. So if we're looking at an action story, that means all the major moments in your story, they have to turn on life and death. What has to be at risk is life and death. So if we pull out the 5 commandments of storytelling that we use at StoryGrid to track change in our story, we know there has to be 5 moments. There has to be an inciting incident. There has to be a turning point, progressive complication. There has to be a crisis, a climax, and a resolution. And what I'm telling you is, based on your genre, what your story is actually about, what the value of your story is, each of those moments in your story, each of those big moments have to be about the value that is attached to your genre. Now, why is this important? Why does this matter? When we talk about genre in these really kind of soft ways that are more about marketing genres like dark romance or science fiction or young adult, it doesn't actually help us have a good conversation about our story, what's going on, and how to fix it. However, if you know you're telling a love story, that tells you a lot about your story. That tells you the major moments in the story, what they're going to turn on. That tells you the conventions that have to be in your story, the obligatory moments. All of these things you find out about your story just by picking the main external genre that you're going to tell your story in. So one of the main problems that we see at StoryGrid when people are writing is not being super clear on their genre, which means super clear on the value at stake, which means super clear on what the characters in their story want. We see a lot of meandering scenes, meandering stories, because the writer won't lock in on one thing that they're really talking about. And so when we're talking about genre, when we're thinking about genre inside of StoryGrid, it's important to understand that we are talking about the value at stake in your story. And that value comes from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Because a lot of times I think we forget when we're telling stories that we're just telling stories about real life. Now it's hyper realistic. It's like real life with the contrast turned up and all the boring parts cut out, but it is mapping onto real life. So that's why you can pull what your story is about from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because it tracks all of the needs that we have as human beings. And so picking one that your story is about, that is going to focus on, that the whole arc of the story has to turn on that value, you're going to see a huge difference in your writing. You're going to be much more clear on what you need to write next and what needs to happen next in your story. And so there's a lot of great tools. If you want to dig further into this, you can go to storygrid.com. We have lots of books. We have lots of articles there to dig further into what your genre is. You can find conventions, obligatory moments, all of that stuff. But for now, when you're writing your story and we're talking about genre, no more soft words, no more talking about my book is science fiction or my book is young adult. Your book is about a value, and that value maps onto a genre, and there's only 12 of them.